fall asleep to entire history of the Crusades. Medieval war, it begins not with swords, but with silence. A silence that stretched across the hills of Old Jerusalem, where warm winds carried dust through broken stones. A silence that lingered in the cracks of ancient roads, once walked by prophets. Centuries before the armies gathered, before banners were raised, there were only pilgrims. Quiet men and women, moving slowly through forgotten towns, whispering prayers as they touched the walls of sacred shrines. There was no war then, only longing. For something sacred. For a return to something lost. And in the courts of kings and the halls of monks, there were maps of dreams and stories of distant lands. Stories of a grave said to be empty, of a tomb carved into stone, of a place where death had once been defeated, if only for a moment. It was not power that moved them first. It was memory. It was grief. It was the weight of a story they could not forget. Across the kingdoms of Europe, the people believed. They believed not in conquest, but in the holiness of space, the holiness of earth, the holiness of walking where the sacred once stood. And in the east, where the old empires still breathed, the great cities watched. Byzantium stood as a tired sentinel, caught between fading Rome and rising Islam. The emperor there wore robes heavy with history. His court filled with worry, for the lands were shifting, and in the desert beneath the call of the minaret, new rulers held the holy city. Not gently, not always kindly, but firmly. The roads grew dangerous. Pilgrims were robbed, shrines closed. The silence was breaking, and with it, a question began to grow. Not from the peasants, not from the common faithful, but from the corners of court, from Rome, from the papacy. A question wrapped in the language of faith, but made from the bones of politics. What should be done? Who had the right to claim the sacred? Who had the strength to defend it? The questions were quiet at first, like a shadow at the edge of a candle. But they grew, and as they grew, the silence began to shift. Something was coming, and in the hearts of many, it felt inevitable, like a storm building far away. You cannot see it yet, but the air tells you. The wind feels different. The birds fall quiet. There is a pause in the rhythm of life. We love you, dear listener. We're so grateful you're here. Before we begin this story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. It is hard to say exactly when it began. There was no clear spark, no singular moment that set the fire. Instead, there were cracks, splinters across the map of Europe and the Middle East. The Islamic world was vast now. From the plains of Persia to the gates of Spain, it had stretched and grown, with caliphs ruling cities of marble and gold. In Damascus, in Baghdad, in Cairo, there was learning, trade, and belief. The Quran echoed in the streets, and science walked beside it. But the empires were not unified. Power was held in pieces, passed from one ruler to another like a delicate bowl, too easy to drop. And in the Christian lands, things were no simpler. The church was growing in strength, yet divided in its soul. East and West had split. Rome and Constantinople no longer spoke with one voice. The old unity had broken long ago. Now they eyed each other with suspicion, even as they faced the same threats. And within the lands of Europe, lords ruled with iron hands. Castles rose in forested hills. Peasants tilled land that would never belong to them. And yet they all prayed to the same God. They all looked to the east with a quiet ache. The Holy Land had become more than land. It was an idea, a promise, a wound that had never truly healed. When word came of pilgrims attacked, of churches desecrated, of relics stolen, something shifted. In France, in Italy, in the German lands, voices began to rise, voices that said this could not stand, that the sacred must be defended, the tomb must be reclaimed. Not with diplomacy, not with prayer alone, but with force. And in the background, kings listened and waited. For war was costly. It drained coffers and blood, but it also offered glory and absolution and power. The people would not rise for taxes, but they might rise for God. And behind them, in the stillness of Rome, the Pope waited, watching the world turn, weighing each silence. The man who would change everything was not a soldier. He was not a king. He was a pope with a worn face and eyes like stone. Urban II, they called him. He had sat in councils and walked among the nobles. He knew their greed. He knew their fear. And he knew how to speak to the ache in their souls. In 1095, he travelled to a small town called Clermont. It was not a city of power, but it was where power would be spoken. The Pope stood before a crowd of knights, priests, and peasants. The air was cold, the wind sharp. He raised his hands and spoke of the East. He spoke of the danger, the heresy, the defilement of the holy places. But more than that, he spoke of opportunity, of sins washed away by battle, of eternal reward for those who died in the cause. He did not ask. He summoned, he commanded, and the people answered, with tears, with cries, with a roar that echoed across the land. Deus vult, they shouted. God wills it. It was not the voice of Rome alone. It was the voice of something deeper, the buried grief of Christendom, the old longing, the sacred hunger. Urban had reached into the past and brought it to the surface. And in doing so, he had set something loose. A crusade, a holy war, a march not for land, but for heaven. Or so they believed. And in every village, every town, people began to gather. Not just knights, but farmers, butchers, carpenters, women, children, all drawn by the pull of the cross. They sewed it onto their cloaks, marked it on their flesh. Some thought it would be quick. Others thought it would be glorious. Most did not think at all. They simply walked eastward, toward the unknown, and the storm that had once been a whisper was now a cry. It rolled across the hills, across the fields, across the centuries, yet for all the noise, there was still confusion. No one had done this before, not like this. The armies that formed were wild, undisciplined. The first crusaders were not the nobles and their knights. They were the poor, the desperate. Thousands of them moved without plan or order, led by men who claimed visions. Preachers in tattered robes. Peter the Hermit was one, a man with fire in his eyes and dust on his feet. He walked barefoot from town to town, preaching the need to take up the cross. His words burned, and they followed. Through Germany, through Hungary, through the Balkans. They sang as they walked, but they also killed. Jews were massacred along the Rhine. Towns burned in the name of purity. The holy cause, even in its infancy, was already stained, and still they moved. Toward Constantinople, toward the east. The emperor there watched them come. This was not what he had asked for. When he called for help, he had meant trained soldiers. Allies, not mobs, not zealots. But they came, and he let them pass. He could not stop them. And soon they crossed the Bosporus, into Asia Minor, into Seljuk lands, where the real war would begin. They were slaughtered, almost all of them, cut down by seasoned soldiers who fought not for faith, but for empire. The crusade, as it had started, was shattered, but it was only the beginning. Behind them, real armies were forming, nobles with wealth and armor, men who knew war, men who believed, and men who wanted land. As the poor fell, the powerful prepared, and the silence that had once held the world before the storm was now gone, replaced by footsteps, by banners, by steel. Long before swords crossed, long before kings wept on the shores of lost cities, there were pilgrims, not soldiers, just quiet souls moving eastward through unfamiliar land. They came from Normandy, from Lombardy, from the cold, damp villages of the Rhineland. They brought nothing but faith and fragile hopes. Some sought forgiveness, others sought healing, and many simply wanted to walk where the stories had begun. They passed through forests and across rivers, through border towns and dry plains. They knelt in crumbling chapels and wept beside sacred springs. For a time, it was enough. The road to Jerusalem was not easy, but it was open. And the Holy Land, though under Islamic rule, was not closed. Muslim leaders, pragmatic and often weary of endless war, allowed the travelers to pass. Jerusalem was sacred to them too. The Prophet had prayed there. The dome of the rock stood like a quiet sentinel above the Temple Mount. It was not a place of blood then. Not yet. But time wears away tolerance. And in the shifting courts of the Middle East, power changed hands quickly. The Seljuk Turks came, down from Central Asia. Fierce riders, new to the old lands. They did not yet understand the tangled roots of the place they now ruled. They pushed out older dynasties. They spread east and west, breaking the fragile balance. Cities were taken. Shrines were closed. And the pilgrims who once passed in silence now faced insults, robbery, sometimes worse. Rumors spread westward like smoke. Some were true, some were not. But truth matters less than fear. And fear began to settle like ash in the minds of the faithful. In the churches of Europe, the stories grew darker. The East became a shadowed place, a place of fallen grace. And into that shadow, popes and preachers cast their light. They spoke of lost brothers, of sacred places in chains, of wrongs that cried out for justice. The pain of the pilgrims became a symbol, a quiet fire that began to warm the cold halls of power. Something had shifted. The journey that was once spiritual was now becoming political. And once power touches belief, it never lets go. Across the waters, Constantinople stood between two worlds, a city of gold roofs and tired hearts. The Eastern Roman Empire, once a titan, now wore its crown loosely. Byzantium had survived longer than most thought it would, through invasions, betrayals, plagues, and fire. But by the 11th century, it was shrinking. The Seljuks had pushed deep into its territory. Anatolia, the empire's beating heart, was no longer safe. Battle after battle had drained its strength, and the emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, knew what others only guessed. Without help, Byzantium might fall, and if it fell, the road to Jerusalem would vanish behind it. So he made a decision, one that history would remember far longer than he likely imagined. He reached westward, toward Rome, toward the Latin church that had broken away centuries earlier. It was not a choice made from love. It was survival. The Great Schism of 1054 had left wounds that had barely begun to scar. The two churches no longer shared sacraments or language. They no longer trusted one another. But Alexios sent messengers anyway. They carried letters written in care and anxiety, letters that asked for aid. And Pope Urban, already stirring the hearts of Europe, saw the opportunity. If the East asked for help, the West could offer more than soldiers. It could offer unity. Under Rome, the plan that followed was fragile, a promise of cooperation between old enemies. Byzantium would offer safe passage. The West would send men, and the Holy Land might be saved. But in between the lines of letters and handshakes, old suspicions remained. Alexios wanted mercenaries. Rome wanted redemption. And the soldiers who were coming wanted far more than either had promised. They wanted land. They wanted titles. They wanted victory written into the stone of cities. It was a fragile pact held together by fear. And fear rarely lasts. The first real wave of Crusaders arrived like a tide of thunder. Unlike the peasant bands that had come before and perished in the dust of Anatolia, this new force was powerful, organized, and led by men who understood war. They came under banners gilded in gold and blood, each noble claiming his own destiny, his own dream of heaven and inheritance. There was Raymond of Toulouse, grim and stubborn, Godfrey of Bouillon, silent and devout, Bohemond of Taranto, fierce and cunning. Each had his own ambitions. None fully trusted the others. And yet they marched together, loosely bound by faith and rivalry. They crossed into Byzantine lands and were met not with celebration, but unease. Emperor Alexios saw them for what they were. Armed pilgrims, yes, but also potential conquerors. He offered them food, gold, and guidance, but he demanded oaths. Swear to return any captured territory to the empire, he said. Some agreed reluctantly, others lied. There was no unity, only the illusion of it. And so they pressed on, a holy army built on competing desires. When they reached Nicaea, a city now held by the Seljuks, they laid siege. Byzantines helped, cautiously. The siege was slow and bitter. Eventually the city fell, not to the Crusaders, but to Byzantine negotiation. Alexios had quietly struck a deal. The city surrendered to him. The Crusaders were furious. Their prize had been stolen by diplomacy. The alliance cracked further, but the road still led east, toward Jerusalem, and so they continued. Across dry hills, through hostile terrain, they faced ambushes, thirst, and mistrust. Yet still, they moved forward, each step closer to something none of them had ever seen. A city spoken of in sermons and stories. A city carved into their dreams since childhood. And the cracks beneath their unity grew deeper with each mile. The Pope had called them to one cause, but each man marched for his own. As they moved through the land, it was not just the terrain that tested them. It was memory. These were lands soaked in old wars, old betrayals. In Antioch, they would find not just a city, but a mirror, a reflection of all they were about to become. But even before that, whispers of division followed them. Local Christians in the East did not always welcome the Crusaders. They were seen as foreigners, sometimes as barbarians. Their Latin tongue, their Western customs, their impatience, it all clashed with the older, slower rhythms of Eastern Christianity. And the Muslims, though divided among themselves, began to notice. Rumors of a great army spread through the courts of Aleppo, Damascus, and Mosul. Responses were slow, but they came. Forces were summoned, spies sent, and still the Crusaders marched on, through rain and drought, through hunger and doubt. Their faith held them, but so did ambition. And ambition burns. In every tent, men dreamed not only of salvation, but of titles. Some whispered of becoming kings in the East, of carving new realms from ancient soil. Jerusalem was still far, but already power had become the true pilgrimage. When they reached Antioch, everything would change. The siege that followed would stretch the limits of endurance and belief, but that would come later. For now, the cracks widened, alliances frayed, the Byzantines pulled back, the Crusaders grew bolder, and the original promise, the one of sacred rescue and spiritual purity, began to fade beneath the weight of strategy. The Holy War had begun as a prayer. It was becoming a competition, one built on unspoken betrayals and fading trust. And in the quiet distance, the holy city waited, unaware that it was becoming a symbol in a game it did not control. The voice that started the war was not carried by steel. It was not the sound of drums or the clash of swords. It was the sound of a man standing in a field, raising his hands beneath a grey November sky. Clermont was not a place of power. It had no great throne or cathedral, no seat of empire. But in 1095, it became a turning point in the memory of the world. Pope Urban II spoke to a crowd that had gathered with little idea of what they were about to hear. Some were nobles, some were peasants, some were simply curious. He did not shout. His words were measured, carried by the wind like a low hymn. But what he said shook the soul of Christendom. He spoke of brothers in the East, of churches desecrated, of sacred lands profaned by foreign hands. He described horrors that blurred the line between truth and legend. Tales of blood spilled in sanctuaries, of crosses shattered, of the faithful slaughtered on holy ground. It was not the accuracy of these claims that mattered. It was the way they felt. They touched something deep in the hearts of those who listened. A sense of loss, of shame, of duty. He called upon them not as subjects, but as guardians of the sacred. And then he offered something no king could give: remission, absolution, eternal reward for those who fought and fell in God's name. To die in this war would be to be born into paradise. The field fell silent. Then came the cry, Deus vult, God wills it. The word spread like fire, through the streets of cities, across the hills of France, into the valleys of Italy. Men carved crosses into their flesh. Women wept as their sons pledged their swords. The Pope had not merely called for war. He had turned belief into command. He had opened the gates to something no one would ever truly control again. They came not with banners, but with hunger, with hope, with bare feet and patched cloaks. The First Crusade was not an army. It was a movement. Thousands of poor men and women, stirred by Urban's voice, left their homes with no knowledge of war and no plan for survival. Some believed they would reach Jerusalem within weeks. Others thought miracles would pave the way. They followed preachers rather than generals. Peter the Hermit was among them. Small in stature, fierce in conviction. He had no title, but his voice held strange power. He walked with a donkey, barefoot, through village after village, gathering souls like autumn gathers leaves. The movement he led would become known as the People's Crusade. It was not blessed with strategy. It was driven by emotion. And emotion, when unmoored from reason, turns dangerous. As they moved through Europe, fear turned to violence. In the Rhineland, Jews were slaughtered. Entire communities were destroyed in the name of purification. Men who had never seen Jerusalem convinced themselves that they were already cleansing it. Women who had never held a sword watched their husbands become executioners. It was not war. It was a storm of faith and fire. And it had only begun. They reached Byzantine lands, ragged and starving. Emperor Alexios was horrified. He had expected knights. Instead, he saw mobs. But he let them pass. He had no other choice. Across the Bosporus they went into lands held by the Seljuk Turks. And there, in the dry hills of Anatolia, they were destroyed, ambushed, cut down, scattered. Few survived. Those who returned did so with stories of betrayal and divine testing. Those who died were buried beneath a sky that had not asked for them. The People's Crusade had ended, but the true war had not yet begun. Behind them came the ones the Pope had truly called. Princes and counts, knights clad in chainmail, followed by armies with order and supplies. These were not pilgrims in rags. These were men who knew how to lay siege, how to ride in formation, how to make war with precision. They had sworn oaths, but they also carried ambitions. Each noble dreamed of more than salvation: titles, land, glory. For some, the cross was painted over a sword. They reached Constantinople not as beggars, but as guests. Alexios greeted them cautiously. He demanded loyalty, though he did not trust their loyalty would last. In private, he feared them as much as he feared the Turks, but he gave them ships and guides. They crossed into Asia Minor, and for the first time, the Crusaders faced the Seljuk forces directly. The Turks were not new to war. They fought with speed and strategy, their horse archers swift and deadly. But they were not unified. Their sultanate, stretched thin, had grown careless. In the Battle of Dorylaeum, the Crusaders were ambushed. Panic surged through the camp. Men screamed, horses bolted, but they did not collapse. They regrouped, held their ground, and when reinforcements arrived, the Turks were driven back. It was a hard-earned victory. one that gave the Crusaders belief that this could be done, that the path to Jerusalem was possible, yet it also taught them something else. This would not be simple. The land would resist them. The heat, the thirst, the enemy, even faith, which had brought them so far, could not shield them from fear. And fear would follow them through every city, every valley, every siege that lay ahead. The road turned harder after that, not just physically, but spiritually. The Crusaders believed they were doing holy work, but holiness began to wear thin beneath hunger and heat. They reached Antioch, an ancient city with high walls and deep history. It stood between them and Jerusalem. They could not pass it by, and so they surrounded it. What followed was not a battle, but a test. The siege lasted for months. Supplies ran out. Men died from disease more often than from swords. Horses were eaten. Arguments turned to threats. Morale began to crack. Still, they held the line. Bohemond, with sharp eyes and sharper ambition, took control. He found a traitor within the city, a gatekeeper willing to betray his own in exchange for safety. And one night, the Crusaders entered through the darkness. Antioch fell, but the victory was hollow. The very next day, Muslim reinforcements arrived. Now the Crusaders were the ones under siege, trapped within the city they had just taken, starving again, surrounded. Hope faded. Then came a rumor. A monk claimed he had received a vision, that the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, was buried beneath the city. Men dug feverishly, and when a piece of rusted iron was found, it was declared a miracle. Spirits rose, strength returned. They fought back, and they won. Barely, but the cost was deep. Thousands had died. The city was ruined, and already disputes broke out among the leaders over who would rule it. The sacred was being divided like spoils, and Jerusalem was still far away. The road stretched onward, littered with bones and burned promises. Faith remained, but it had become something else now. Not just belief, but resolve. And resolve does not shine. It hardens. The land beyond Antioch was quiet in ways that unsettled even the hardest men. Wind moved through olive trees, and birds circled above burned-out farmhouses. The Crusaders had taken the city, but they had lost more than they had gained. Disease, betrayal, hunger, and exhaustion had thinned their numbers, and those who remained were no longer men of simple faith. They had seen too much, tasted too much death. They were harder now, sharper, more suspicious. Bohemond of Taranto claimed Antioch as his own. Despite promises to return all captured cities to the Byzantine Empire, he stayed. His oaths faded with the smoke of battle. Others grumbled but did not stop him. The alliance that had once been held together by shared belief now hung by threads of ambition. And yet, the march resumed. Southward. Always southward. Toward a city most of them had never seen, but all had imagined. Jerusalem. It was no longer just a destination. It had become a ghost they chased through ruined villages and broken landscapes. The journey from Antioch was long, cruel, and silent. Heat drained the strength from horses. Wells ran dry. Fields, once filled with grain, were now scorched or abandoned. The Seljuks, fractured and reeling, no longer offered full resistance. But their absence was not peace. It was tension, like the pause between breaths. In that pause, the Crusaders became something else. Less an army, more a tide. They took what they needed. They did not ask. Muslim villages fell without mercy. Even Christian towns suffered if they could not feed the march. No one could stand in their way. And few tried. The holy war had become a road of ashes. And still, Jerusalem lay ahead, silent, waiting. The Crusaders had heard of the city all their lives. It was carved into scripture, painted in mosaics, sung in quiet chants at the end of long fasts. They imagined golden domes and soft hills, voices of angels rising above stone walls. But what they found when they finally reached its gates in the summer of 1099 was not heaven. It was a fortress, a walled city that stood against them with silence and strength. The Fatimid Caliphate now held Jerusalem. They had only recently taken it from the Seljuks, and their garrison was small but determined. As the Crusaders arrived, they saw not a divine city but stone and fire. The siege began under a sky that offered no shade. Heat clung to every breath. The land around Jerusalem was dry, unwilling to give. Water had to be dragged from distant springs. Food grew scarce again. Still, the Crusaders built siege towers, catapults, battering rams. They had learned from Antioch. They would not be trapped again. Each night they prayed. Some fasted. Others wept. A few had visions. It was no longer just about reaching the city. It was about taking it, owning it, claiming it in the name of a promise made years ago. And with each passing day, the pressure grew. The sense that all of it, the journey, the death, the hope, would mean nothing if they failed. Finally, in July, they struck. One tower reached the wall, a gate gave way, and the Crusaders poured into Jerusalem like a river that had broken its banks. What followed was not holy. It was slaughter. The streets ran red. Muslim defenders were cut down. Jewish families burned in their synagogues. Few were spared. The city that had been the dream of millions became a grave. It was not a planned massacre. It was a release. Years of suffering, fear, hunger, and rage erupted in one terrifying moment. And then it was quiet again. The city lay beneath them, bruised and still. The Crusaders knelt in the church of the Holy Sepulchre. They kissed the stone. They whispered prayers. Some wept, but outside the smoke still rose. When the killing stopped, the dividing began. Land, titles, power. Jerusalem was not just a symbol anymore. It was real, with walls, markets, homes, and people. And real things must be governed. Godfrey of Bouillon, who had fought with discipline and silence since the beginning, was offered the crown. He refused the title of king. He said no man should wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn one of thorns. Instead, he called himself defender of the Holy Sepulchre. But his humility did not prevent division. The other nobles had their eyes on cities along the coast. Tripoli, Jaffa, Acre. Slowly they carved out realms from the lands they had taken. The kingdom of Jerusalem was born not in peace, but in calculation. Fortresses were built. Laws were written. Latin clergy replaced Eastern ones. A new order rose from this blood. And yet, the Crusaders were few. Surrounded by hostile territory, they could not rest. Reinforcements came slowly. Supply lines were uncertain, and the local population, Muslim and Christian alike, watched them with cold eyes. The Crusaders tried to govern. They appointed barons, set taxes, built churches, but they were foreigners, and the land remembered it. Every wall they raised was a sign of distance. Every Latin prayer echoed in unfamiliar ears. Still, they believed. They had come to save Jerusalem, and they had done it. For now, that was enough. But the work of keeping it would be longer, harder, and lonelier than the work of taking it. The march had ended, but power had only begun. In Europe, the news arrived slowly. Messengers rode for months across mountains and rivers, and when they came, they were met with joy. Bells rang in Paris, Pisa, Cologne. Monks recorded the victory in glowing words. The holy city had been reclaimed. The cross had triumphed. Sermons filled with awe and triumph swept through the churches of the West. For a moment, all the loss was forgotten. The children left behind. The fathers who never returned. The broken harvests. The emptied villages. The crusade was declared a miracle. But miracles are hard to live with. In Jerusalem, those who stayed behind soon discovered that holding power is far more delicate than seizing it. The Fatimids still controlled Egypt. Other Muslim emirs still ruled cities nearby. Resistance simmered. The Crusaders built alliances where they could. They learned to negotiate, to trade, even to compromise. Some intermarried, others converted. The lines between faith and survival blurred. But the myth of purity, of holy conquest, was too strong to fade. And so, when new pilgrims arrived from the west, they expected to find a shining kingdom of saints. Instead, they found tension, dust, walls that were more military than sacred, and knights who no longer looked like heroes. Some went home disillusioned, others stayed, hoping to help. And still, the kingdom held. Fragile, but standing. It would not fall quickly, but it would always be haunted, not just by the people it had killed or displaced, but by its own memory, by the dream that had brought it into being. A dream now trapped in stone and policy. The crusade had been a march of hope. It had become a march of power. And power once taken does not rest. After the city's walls had been claimed, and the dust of battle settled into the cracked streets, a new reality dawned, not one of peace, but one of fragile power held in trembling hands. Jerusalem, once a dream whispered through prayer, became a kingdom weighed down by blood and silence. The Crusaders found themselves rulers over a land that did not welcome them as saviors, but watched them as strangers who had stormed in and claimed what was not theirs. The city's narrow lanes carried the echoes of lives lost, of homes burned, and of a faith that had been both shield and sword. Yet beneath the surface of their triumph, the cracks in this new world began to show. Jerusalem was but one piece in a patchwork of realms carved from ancient lands. Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, each governed by men who answered only to themselves and the distant pope. Loyalties were fragile threads, often broken in favor of personal gain. The dream of a united Christendom holding the Holy Land was fading like a candle's flame in the night. Power drew men apart, not together. In the courts of these new kingdoms, whispers spread, whispers of betrayals, shifting alliances, and greed. The very faith that had sparked the crusade began to be used as a weapon for control rather than salvation. The knights who had marched with crosses sewn onto their cloaks now bore new marks, seals of baronies and lordships, tokens of earthly dominion that stood in uneasy tension with their spiritual vows. The land itself bore witness to this transformation. Olive groves were uprooted for fortifications. Ancient churches were replaced by military outposts, and the people, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, lived under the shadow of foreign rule, caught between hope and despair. The Crusaders, distant from their homes, faced loneliness and suspicion. Some sought solace in faith, others in bitter resolve. The kingdom, fragile as a leaf in the wind, was already burning at its edges. Beyond Jerusalem's walls, the surrounding Muslim states watched with quiet fury. The Fatimids of Egypt, recent holders of the city before its fall, plotted in shadows. Other emirates and sultanates eyed the Crusaders as invaders, not just enemies. Though divided among themselves, a new figure was beginning to rise from the turmoil. Saladin. He was neither a king nor a conqueror at first, but a leader shaped by the need to unite a fractured world. His vision was not of endless war, but of reclamation. Jerusalem was not merely a prize of battle, but a symbol of faith and identity for the Muslim world. Saladin moved carefully, building alliances with tribes, rulers, and warriors. He spoke of justice and faith, of restoring balance without endless bloodshed. But the flames of conflict, once lit, do not easily die. Raids and skirmishes continued along the borders. The Crusader states, thin and stretched, relied heavily on reinforcements and supplies from Europe, a fragile thread in a dangerous tapestry. The people living in the contested lands endured cycles of violence and uneasy peace. Towns were abandoned, farms burned, families displaced. Silence often followed the worst storms, but it was never lasting. The war had seeped into every corner of life. It was no longer just a battle for a city. It was a war for souls, for memory, for survival. Inside the Crusader kingdoms, the weight of governance pressed heavily. The rulers struggled to hold together societies that were diverse and divided. They were few in number, but vast in responsibility. The Latin Church sought to impose its authority, often clashing with the Eastern Christian communities who had lived there for centuries. Differences in language, ritual, and tradition became fault lines. The Crusaders were sometimes seen as oppressors rather than liberators. Taxes grew heavier. Land was seized. The tension between settlers and native populations grew palpable. Amidst this, the shadow of the original crusade lingered, the promise of holy purpose and redemption. Yet many knights and nobles began to see the crusade less as a spiritual mission and more as a political tool. Letters crossed the seas from Europe, sometimes demanding loyalty, sometimes offering support, sometimes threatening withdrawal. The bonds between the Holy Land and the West were both lifelines and chains. Meanwhile, new pilgrims continued to arrive, some filled with hope, others with hardened hearts. For many, the reality they encountered was a kingdom under siege, a land of constant fear and preparation for the next wave of battle. The bright dream of salvation was dimmed by the daily struggle of survival. Soldiers prayed not only for God's mercy, but for strength to endure. Children were born into a world of conflict, knowing neither peace nor home. In Europe, the Crusades' initial triumph was remembered with a mixture of pride and myth. Stories spread in monasteries and marketplaces of heroic knights, of miraculous victories, of lands reclaimed. These tales inspired new waves of crusaders, eager to join the cause or claim their share of glory. Yet the reality in the East was more complex. The initial unity of purpose splintered as time passed. Different factions competed for influence. Some sought alliances with Muslim rulers, others rejected all compromise. The Christian kingdoms of Europe were not immune to their own internal conflicts, and the crusade became a mirror reflecting both faith and fracture. Trade routes opened, bringing wealth but also tension. Ideas traveled alongside goods, culture and war intertwined. The memory of the crusade became a story told many ways, a tale of faith, a story of conquest, a tragedy of loss. As the first fires of conflict settled into a slow burn, the world around the Crusader states grew restless. New powers emerged, old empires shifted, and the promise of lasting peace remained a distant hope. Yet even as battles raged in the shadows, life pressed on. Farmers tilled scarred land, merchants crossed dangerous roads, families gathered in small churches and mosques, seeking moments of grace amid the turmoil. The war was everywhere, in the silence after a skirmish, in the cautious glance between neighbor and stranger, in the prayers whispered in the dark. It was a world on fire, but also a world trying to hold itself together. The first flames of the Crusades had burned bright and fierce, lighting a path of faith and fury. But the fire would not cleanse. It would consume, and in its wake, it would leave a land changed forever. The sound of swords clashing and banners flying was not the only war the Crusades stirred. Far from the dusty roads of the Holy Land, another battle unfolded quietly across Europe. It was a war of hearts and homes, the fields left untended, the children left fatherless, the wives left with prayers more than promises. The crusade was not just a journey east, it was a transformation west. Villages emptied as men left, following the call of the cross. Farms grew wild beneath the summer sun. Markets slowed and sometimes closed. The rhythm of life shifted in subtle ways, like a forgotten melody slipping beneath noise. Those who stayed behind carried heavy burdens. They carried fear, not just for their loved ones far away, but for the futures unraveling at home. The absence of husbands and sons left gaps that no word could fill. Letters traveled slowly, often never reaching the hands that longed for them. News was filtered through rumor, hope tangled with despair. The church tried to offer comfort, sermons woven with promises of heaven and reunion. But the earth beneath grew heavier. Families waited by firesides, clutching worn crosses and faded prayers. They watched seasons turn, counting the days and wondering if the men who left would ever return whole. In cities, the departure of knights and nobles reshaped power. New rulers emerged, some greedy, some cautious. Loyalties changed like shifting sands. The Crusades were distant, but their shadows reached every hearth. The call to arms stirred more than just soldiers. It stirred change in the very fabric of medieval society. The church's voice grew louder, its power extending deeper into daily life. To fight in the crusade was declared a sacred duty, a path to salvation. Those who stayed behind were reminded of their own roles in this spiritual struggle. Tithes increased to support the war effort. Monasteries sent prayers and soldiers alike. Towns fortified themselves, preparing for threats both known and imagined. The promise of eternal reward brought men to the battlefield, but it also sowed seeds of fear. Fear of damnation for those who hesitated. Fear of betrayal for those who faltered. The line between faith and obligation blurred, and in that blur grew tension. Some saw the Crusades as a holy cause. Others saw them as a costly distraction from the troubles closer to home. Peasant revolts whispered in the north. Noble feuds erupted in the south. The wars in the east shaped the politics of Europe in subtle, persistent ways. Old alliances weakened. New ones formed under the banner of the cross. The Crusades became a mirror reflecting not only the hopes of Christendom, but its fractures and fears. Yet beneath the politics and sermons, the true cost was found in silence. Silent dinners where seats remained empty. Silent nights where prayers carried the weight of absence. The women left behind held more than the hearth. They held memory. They kept alive the stories of battles and saints, of valor and loss. They watched their children grow with faces marked by longing. The distant war shaped their lives in quiet, profound ways. Some took up arms in defense of their homes, others became keepers of lands and titles, stepping into roles once held by absent men. Their strength was a different kind of battle, one often forgotten in the grand tales. The war had crossed seas and deserts, but it had also settled in the hearts of those waiting. And the weight of that waiting could be heavier than any sword. The church, for all its promises, struggled to contain the chaos it had unleashed. Pilgrimages increased, not all of them peaceful. Bands of crusaders traveled without papal sanction, seeking their own fortunes and glory. Sometimes these groups turned violent at home, attacking those they saw as enemies of the faith. Jews, heretics, even fellow Christians. The lines between holy war and persecution blurred. The streets of some towns ran with blood before the distant battles had ended. In the courts of kings and queens, decisions made in the name of Christ shaped the fate of entire regions. Taxes rose to fund armies, draining the wealth of peasants and merchants alike. Trade routes shifted, bringing new goods but also new tensions. The Crusades were not distant events confined to the East. They were forces reshaping Europe itself, often in ways no one fully understood until much later. The echoes of these changes would ripple through centuries. And still, the distant war continued. Letters brought stories of victory and defeat, of broken alliances and new friendships forged in blood. Each report carried a mixture of hope and sorrow. Europe listened with bated breath, its faith tied to the fortunes of men far away. The Crusaders who returned bore scars, both visible and invisible. Some came back with gold and tales of glory. Others returned hollow, haunted by what they had seen and done. The journey east changed them, and the land they left behind was not always ready for those changes. The homecoming was often quieter than the departure, marked by grief and silence, rather than celebration. Families adjusted. Wounds healed slowly. But the memory of the crusade lingered in homes and hearts. It was a chapter of loss as much as of faith. The war at home was not one of swords and banners, but it was no less real. It was written in the empty chairs, the whispered prayers, the shifting loyalties of a world caught between devotion and survival. The Crusades shaped not only distant lands, but the very soul of Europe, setting in motion changes that would echo through generations. And in the quiet corners of villages and cities, the true cost of this holy war was felt. A cost measured not in victories or defeats, but in the slow, steady loss of what once was, and the uncertain hope of what might be. There were stretches of time when the dust finally settled, when swords hung still in scabbards, and the cries of war gave way to quiet wind. In these moments between battles, the world did not return to peace. It simply paused, as if even the earth needed breath. In the Crusader kingdoms, this silence was heavy, not peaceful. The walls still stood, the watchtowers still burned lamps through the night, and every gate was still guarded. But there were no marching feet, no new banners on the horizon. Just the sounds of goats moving through dry grass, of monks whispering psalms to half-empty churches, of stone being stacked in silence to rebuild what had fallen. This was not peace, but the stillness that comes after exhaustion. Jerusalem had been won, and other cities had followed, but holding them required more than walls and garrisons. It required patience, resolve, something deeper than fire. And so the knights stayed. They mended armor. They trained in dusty courtyards. They stared at the sky for signs of rain or warning. They prayed, though not always with the same certainty they once held. Some had come seeking glory, others had come seeking God, and many now stood between those two things, unsure of where one ended and the other began. In this silence, wounds festered. Not only those carved by swords, but those within. The memory of battles lingered. Men who had once been called heroes woke from dreams trembling. Others felt nothing at all. They had seen too much and too little. The quiet pressed down like a stone on the chest. Waiting became its own kind of war. In towns across the Levant, the people adjusted to this new rhythm. Muslim traders passed under Latin rule, offering spices and cloth, their eyes cast low. Local Christians, long used to living under changing masters, learned the names of new lords and paid their taxes to different courts. Jewish families watched from the margins, unsure of their place in the story. Life did not stop. It adapted. Markets reopened. Weddings resumed. Fields were sown again, carefully, beneath the gaze of foreign watchmen. Yet the fear never left. It lived in the way windows were shuttered early, in the way voices lowered when speaking of power, in the way children were taught to listen before they spoke. The Crusader lords sent messages home requesting reinforcements, gold, grain. Some came, others did not. Europe, still stirred by the memory of conquest, had begun to look inward again. Political tensions, local wars, disputes between kings and popes, these too needed soldiers. And so the Crusader states learned to live with less, with fewer men, fewer resources, fewer dreams. They became quieter, harder. The great promise of unity faded, replaced by individual struggles for survival. In this quiet season, the air was thick with watching, not just from walls or towers, but from the soul of the land itself. A land that had seen so many conquests, so many empires, and now watched these new rulers with ancient weariness. Not all silences are empty. Some are filled with slow, unseen change. During the lulls between wars, knowledge moved. Not just swords, but ideas. Arab medicine, preserved and advanced during centuries of Islamic learning, began to reach Latin minds. Books, copied in dusty corners, made their way from Muslim libraries to Christian monasteries. Mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy traveled alongside olive oil and silk. Scholars who once thought their world complete began to see how much had been forgotten. A young knight, wounded in battle and treated by a local healer, might return to Europe with more than scars. He might return with stories of remedies and wisdom unknown in the West. And back in Europe, those stories took root. The Crusades had opened wounds, but also doors. Trade routes strengthened. Ports along the Mediterranean bustled with merchants from every corner of the known world. Venetian ships carried spices and gold, but also questions. What else lay beyond? What else had been hidden? What did it mean to be Christian in a world that was not? These were not questions answered with swords. They settled slowly, shaping the centuries to come. In this time between battles, the Crusader states served as strange meeting places, where priests debated with imams, where Latin knights ate dates harvested by Arab hands, where conflict and coexistence sat side by side at dusty crossroads. The silence did not erase the hatred, but it made room for curiosity. And sometimes, curiosity did more than conquest ever could. Yet the silence also bred its own dangers. Idleness in places built on war often turns inward. Knights who had no battle to fight found reasons to feud among themselves. Petty rivalries flared. Fortresses once united under a holy cause now bristled against one another. The Crusader states, never truly cohesive, began to fracture more visibly. Edessa argued with Antioch. Jerusalem eyed Tripoli with suspicion. Lords issued edicts not to protect the faithful, but to increase their own reach. And within these walls, new voices rose, voices who questioned the crusade altogether. Some monks whispered that the bloodshed had gone too far, that the dream had been twisted, that the cross had been used to justify pride, not piety. Others, older and wearier, simply stopped speaking at all. The holy fire that once swept Europe had become a slow-burning ember in the east. It still glowed, but it didn't warm. It only warned. Outside the walls, new leaders gathered strength. Muslim commanders, once scattered and uncertain, began to organize. Letters crossed deserts. Promises were made. Lands once divided began to imagine unity again, not to conquer Europe, but to reclaim their own. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Aleppo, the wind shifted. A storm was coming, but for now, only the silence remained. A silence full of waiting, breathing, watching, as if the land itself was preparing. And in the midst of this stillness, the Crusaders stood, some praying, some plotting, some simply enduring. They did not know when the next war would come, only that it would. The silence between battles was not peace. It was the memory of war echoing forward, disguised as rest. It was a lull in a story that had never truly ended. The banners still hung. The swords were still sharp. And somewhere in the dust and ash of these quiet years, the next chapter was already stirring. It began again not with swords, but with stories. Tales of a fallen city whispered across the cold stone corridors of Europe. Edessa, the oldest of the Crusader states, had fallen in the winter of 1144. Its gates, once proud, had broken under pressure not of numbers, but of time. The rulers were tired. Their allies had drifted. And in the silence that followed, Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul, seized what had once been held in the name of the cross. The news did not roar. It rustled like wind in brittle leaves. But it reached the ears of popes and kings. And once again, the call came. The Second Crusade. Yet something had changed. The world was no longer caught in that first surge of spiritual heat. Faith was still strong, but it was laced with weariness, with memory, with the questions that time does not silence. Still, they came. This time with more. Not just lords and knights, but kings. Louis VII of France, Conrad III of Germany, monarchs with crowns and courts, not just crosses and prayers. Their presence gave the crusade weight, but also pride. Pride that would not bend, that would not listen. The journey east was difficult, as it had been before, the heat unforgiving, the land unfamiliar. Byzantine guides mistrusted. And again, divisions emerged. Language, command, culture. What was meant to be a united effort soon broke into threads. The Germans marched first, met ambush, suffered loss. The French followed, slower but no wiser. By the time they reached Antioch, many had already turned back or lay beneath foreign soil. But Jerusalem was not the goal. This time, the aim was Damascus, a city that had not attacked them, a city that had once even offered alliance, but now it stood as a symbol. And so they attacked. The siege failed. Supplies ran low. Commanders argued. And the kings left. Their armies broken, their vows unfulfilled. The Second Crusade ended not in triumph, but in quiet retreat. And in its wake, the faith of many bent under the weight of disappointment. But while the West mourned its failure, the East was beginning to gather. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Aleppo, a new name was being spoken. Still softly, but with growing reverence. Saladin. Born of Kurdish blood, he was not born into power. He was given it, slowly, through patience and loyalty. His rise came not by his sword alone, but through discipline, mercy, and a vision clearer than most. He did not shout. He did not boast. He watched. He learned. And when the moment came, he moved. In time, he would take Egypt. Then Syria. Then the hearts of those who had once distrusted him. He spoke of unity, not only to restore land, but to restore dignity. The Muslim world, long divided, long exhausted by its own rivalries, began to breathe as one. And though Saladin did not declare war with fire, he prepared for it with silence. The Crusader states watched nervously. Their letters home grew more desperate. They saw in him something different, not just a commander, but a soul. A man who fought with restraint, who spared where he could, who prayed with the same quiet intensity they had once known in themselves. The Crusaders had always seen the war as one of absolutes. Light and darkness, faith and heresy. But Saladin complicated that. He reminded them that valor was not theirs alone, that justice was not theirs to hold. He had not yet struck, but already the balance had shifted. And as the years passed, the Crusader kingdoms began to thin, not just in number, but in strength. Edessa was gone. Antioch had weakened. Tripoli stood anxious. Even Jerusalem, now ruled by a boy king and a web of regents, stood less like a fortress and more like a relic. New crusaders arrived, but fewer than before. Many came not out of devotion, but for opportunity. Pilgrims and mercenaries, gold seekers and relic hunters. The dream of unity was no longer spoken. The church continued to preach, but the words felt thinner. Echoes of a fire that no longer warmed. The Holy Land was a place of barter and defense, not of renewal. Some lords married into local families. Others grew cruel, mistaking fear for control. Among them rose a man whose name would be carved into both legend and blame, Renaud of Châtillon. A man who defied truces, who raided caravans during peace, who spilled blood on holy days. His violence was not strategic. It was provocation. And Saladin, patient until now, began to respond. First with defense, then with decision. The line had been crossed, not once, but many times. And Jerusalem, the city both sides held sacred, was now at risk again. But even as war drew near, many in the West did not see it. They were distracted by their own disputes, their own crowns, their own shadows. And so the Crusader states stood, outnumbered, overconfident, and increasingly alone. Then came the summer of 1187, the year the silence finally broke. Near the waters of Hattin, beneath the sun that knew too many deaths, the two worlds collided once more. The Crusaders, led by King Guy of Lusignan, marched to defend a fortress under siege. But they were drawn too far, too fast. Their water ran out. The heat consumed them. Their enemies surrounded them, and Saladin struck. Not with rage, but with order. Not with cruelty, but with clarity. The Battle of Hattin was not long. The Christian army, proud and poorly placed, collapsed. Thousands were killed. The true cross, once carried into battle, was taken. The knights captured. King Guy spared. Reynold executed. A message, simple and final. The road to Jerusalem now lay open. Yes, and Saladin did not hesitate. City after city surrendered. Some resisted and fell. Others opened their gates. Seeking mercy, they often received. Saladin did not burn what he claimed. He offered terms. He ransomed captives. He allowed Christians to leave. He entered Jerusalem not as a conqueror drenched in blood, but as a servant of history. He prayed where others had killed. He restored the mosques. He left the churches standing. And in Europe, the cry went up once more. Jerusalem had been lost. Again. This time, not through betrayal or neglect, but by a force that commanded both respect and fear. A force shaped by patience and purpose. The cross had fallen, and with it, many promises. The world turned again. In cities across Christendom, bells tolled. Not in victory, but in warning. The Third Crusade was called before the dust of Hattin had settled. Kings readied ships, popes sharpened words. And yet, beneath the urgency, something had changed. This was no longer the beginning. This was the beginning of reckoning. The dream that once united thousands now felt uncertain, broken not just by enemies, but by time, by pride, by failure. The promises made at Clermont had stretched too far. The sword had lost its shine, and the war, once painted in light and shadow, now showed too many shades of grey. The ships came heavy with armour and hope. They moved across a restless sea, sails full of wind and memory. The Third Crusade was not called in fire, but in the hush that followed failure. Jerusalem had fallen, and with it, something deep and sacred. Europe stirred again, not with purity, but with need. The kings came slowly, not with unity, but with burdened hearts. Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Germans, took the cross with iron discipline. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, sailed with a crown too bright for the dust of war. Philip of France came as well, though his loyalty drifted like smoke. These were not knights seeking heaven. They were rulers guarding pride. The road was long, and from the beginning, it cracked beneath their feet. Frederick drowned before reaching the Holy Land. His army dissolved, scattered by fear and thirst. Philip quarrelled with Richard and turned back early. Only Richard remained, sharp as a blade, singing in camp and fierce in battle. He did not come for peace. He came for correction. The holy city would not fall twice, he believed. And yet, when he landed, he did not march on Jerusalem. He turned north, to Acre. The siege had already begun, long, bitter, and slow. For 2 years, the Crusaders had circled it, digging trenches and dying from heat and plague. Richard brought ships and strategy, but the city did not fall easily. Inside, Muslim defenders stood firm. Outside, Saladin moved like a shadow, appearing and vanishing, testing the Crusaders, but never collapsing. Finally, in the summer of 1191, Acre fell. Its surrender was sealed with blood. Muslim prisoners, thousands, were executed by Richard, not in rage, but as a signal. The war was not over, and mercy was a mirror now, not a promise. Saladin watched, not with fear, but with weight. He had given much. He had held the line, but the war was not a single blow. It was a slow erosion, and even the strongest stone begins to weather. Still, he moved with grace. He countered Richard where he could, avoided direct battle when he must. His army was smaller now, worn thin by siege and heat, but he still held Jerusalem. And he knew Richard, proud, brilliant, impatient, could be drawn away from it. So he waited. The two men exchanged letters. Between sword strikes, they spoke of peace. Saladin offered terms. Richard refused. Then Richard offered terms. Saladin refused. The Holy Land trembled beneath their negotiations. And while neither bent, both understood. This was not the first war, and it would not be the last. Still, the marches continued. Richard took Jaffa, a portkey to the coast, but each gain came at cost. Men died not just in battle, but in beds, from fever, thirst, the slow rot of endless waiting. The sun carved sorrow into every shadow. The Crusaders argued among themselves. Richard scolded his nobles. Saladin reined in his emirs. This was a war no longer fought in bursts, but in slow circling. The tide had turned, but not decisively, and the ground itself seemed to pull at their feet, as if asking, how long can you do this? How long before you forget why you began? Back in Europe, the story was no longer simple. The Crusades had aged. The children of the first warriors were now old men, and their sons did not always believe in the same way. News from the front came in fragments. A siege here, a retreat there. Victories counted in cities, not souls. The idea of the Holy War had grown too large. It no longer fit neatly in prayers or papal bulls. It spilled over into commerce, diplomacy, taxation. Kings used it as leverage. Popes used it as threat. And still, the people paid. Paid in silver. Paid in sons. Paid in fields left bare. In churches left half-built. In futures left behind. In this world, Richard stood like a relic. Brave, but out of place. His battles made legends. His songs echoed in camps. But even he, in quiet moments, began to understand. Jerusalem could be taken. But at what cost? And once taken, could it be kept? His army had grown smaller. His allies had grown restless. And the city still stood. Distant. Silent. Untouched. Twice he approached. Twice he turned back. Not from fear, but from clarity. Saladin watched, and did not chase. Perhaps he too had grown tired of ashes. So they met without meeting. Their swords crossed only a few times, but their thoughts crossed more often. In words sent by messengers, in gestures across battle lines, in small truces that allowed wounded to pass or prisoners to return. The war began to slow, not in weakness, but in wisdom. And when they finally agreed to peace, it was not with triumph, but with necessity. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims could visit. The Crusader states would keep a strip of coast. But the dream of full restoration was gone. It was a compromise, and compromises leave no songs, but it was real, more real than banners and fire. In 1292, Richard boarded a ship to return home. Saladin stayed behind, walking through the streets he had reclaimed, now quieter, now older. Neither man had failed. Neither man had won. They had met in the middle, not as friends, but as men. Tired. Aware. Human. The Third Crusade had not broken the tide, but it had slowed it. War was no longer a crusade of miracles. It was a negotiation of grief, and so the land settled again. Not in peace, but in rhythm. Jerusalem remained whole. The coast was fortified. Pilgrims returned quietly, respectfully, no longer with spears, but with prayers. Saladin died 1 year later, in a room with bare possessions, his wealth given away. His life remembered not for conquest alone, but for mercy and endurance. Richard, captured and ransomed on his way home, would never return to the east. His name would outlast his footsteps, but not his presence. The war faded for a time, but its shape had changed. No longer holy fire, now a pattern. A tide that receded, waiting to return. The years that followed did not bring peace. They brought something quieter, a kind of thinning, a slow unraveling of what had once been so loudly proclaimed. The Crusader states, now reduced to thin strips of coastline, held fast to their cities. Acre, Tyre, Jaffa, but they were islands in a rising sea. The interior was gone. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. Pilgrims still arrived, but they were watched. The church promised new crusades, but the faithful had grown older, poorer, tired. Where once thousands had rushed east in faith, now they trickled in with questions. The war had lasted for generations, and the ground beneath their feet no longer felt like holy soil, only land hardened by too many graves. The knights who stayed lived in tension, surrounded by walls, protected by treaties, but none of it felt certain. They had castles, but fewer allies, horses, but little reason to ride. They kept watch from towers built high on memory. And slowly, the world around them began to change. In Europe, the crusade no longer meant what it once had. It was still preached from pulpits, still sung in song, but it had become something else. A tool, a word with many uses. Kings used it to settle rivalries. Popes used it to raise armies against their own. The Fourth Crusade, promised as a new march to reclaim the Holy Land, never reached Jerusalem. It turned instead toward Constantinople. In 1204, the greatest Christian city in the East, a city that had stood for centuries, filled with icons, mosaics, libraries, was sacked by those who had come in Christ's name. Crusaders looted its churches, broke its altars, burned its palaces. The relics of saints were torn from their shrines and sold across Europe. Gold and silk replaced prayers. Brothers turned on brothers. And in the shadow of that burning city, the soul of the crusade cracked. What had begun as a journey of faith now bore the shape of ambition. In the East, the Muslim world watched with quiet astonishment. They had not needed to lift a sword. Their enemies had undone themselves. For the Crusaders who still held Acre and Tyre, the betrayal was devastating. Byzantium had been no perfect ally, but it had been Christian. Its fall showed that no one was safe, not even those who shared the cross. Time passed. Other crusades were called. Some never left port. Others dissolved in disputes. One crusade, led by children, ended in tragedy. Young boys and girls sent off with songs, never to return. Some were sold into slavery. Others died at sea. It was a symbol, too painful to speak aloud, that even innocence could be lost in the name of a dream too vast for small hands to carry. And still, the coast held. Knights of the Templar and Hospitaller orders continued their routines. They trained, they prayed, they buried their own. They fought small battles, won none that mattered. Supplies from Europe became rare. The memory of the First Crusade, once recited in glowing tales, now felt like another world. The people of the Levant, Christians, Muslims, Jews, lived in the quiet rhythm of siege and retreat. Their stories were no longer shaped by kings, but by hunger, by weather, by days spent walking behind wagons carrying water. The great flame had become ash, not gone, but dull, cold. In the courts of Europe, the idea of crusade remained useful. It brought coins to the church, it gave reason to wars, but it no longer stirred the soul. Popes continued to call for action. Monarchs nodded, few answered. When the Fifth Crusade came, it aimed for Egypt, the heart of Muslim power. The Crusaders took Damietta in 1219. But when they tried to march further, the Nile swallowed them. They were surrounded, exhausted, lost. No great victory. No miracle, just mud, disease, and retreat. Later, Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire tried again. But his crusade was one of letters and diplomacy. He negotiated with Muslim leaders, won back Jerusalem not with blood, but with ink. A treaty signed in quiet, returned the city to Christian hands. But it was an empty return. No triumph, no coronation. The churches reopened, but the streets remained tense. Frederick had not fought. The Pope, furious, excommunicated him, and the Holy City, once regained, was soon lost again. By 1244, it had fallen, this time for good, and still the coast held. Acre, the last stronghold, became the heart of a shrinking world. Merchants arrived, priests wrote letters home, knights grew old within stone walls. Outside, new powers rose. The Mongols thundered through Asia, their armies reshaping everything in their path. For a time, the Crusaders hoped they might help, a great alliance between East and West. But it never came. And in Egypt, the Mamluks, slave soldiers turned sultans, now ruled. Strong, disciplined, relentless. They saw the Crusader states not as holy, but as foreign. Not as spiritual, but political. They prepared, quietly, efficiently, and they waited. The Christians in Acre watched the horizon, still building walls, still training squires, still holding on to a dream that had thinned into dust. No new crusade arrived. Europe had moved on. It was the age of cathedrals now, of learning, of art. The stories of the Holy Land belonged to a generation now gone, and the children of that generation no longer knew the way east. It ended, as so many things do, not with one great blow, but with a final shattering silence. In 1291, the Mamluks marched on Acre. The city, already stretched thin, could not hold. Its walls cracked, its towers fell. Families fled to the sea. Monks clutched relics that could not save them. Knights fought in narrow alleys. And when it was over, the last Crusader city in the Holy Land had fallen. No army came to take it back. No pope declared a new crusade. The coast grew quiet. The ships stopped coming, and the cross, once planted in desert soil with so much fire, was carried back westward, not in triumph, but in memory. A memory shaped not by victory, but by thousands of small defeats. Forgotten skirmishes, broken treaties, cities abandoned, faith worn thin by the weight of years. The Crusades did not die in battle. They faded, slowly, like smoke, and the land, ancient and patient, breathed again. The light was dimmer now, not gone, but fading. Like a candle left to burn too long, its flame curled in on itself, flickering near the end. After the fall of Acre, the air in Europe shifted, not suddenly, but like autumn creeping through late summer leaves. There were still voices calling for crusade, still pulpits where priests wept and begged for knights to ride. But the sound no longer stirred the same fire. The world had grown heavier, older, tired. There had been so many battles, so many long marches. And for what? Jerusalem had been won and lost more than once. Holy relics had been stolen, moved, sold. Blood had been spilled by Christian and Muslim hands alike. The seas had seen ships sink full of soldiers. The deserts had seen bones dry beneath suns too bright for glory. Those who remembered the First Crusade were long buried. And those who now ruled kingdoms had grown up hearing more of failure than of victory. Still, a few tried. A few believed. In the years after Acre's fall, there were plans drawn in candlelight. Letters passed between kings and popes. The idea of one last crusade, one final push to retake the Holy Land and restore the old dream, still flickered. But each attempt began with less. Fewer men, less gold, more doubt. One such hope lived in the heart of Louis IX of France. Known for his piety, he saw the crusade not as conquest, but as penance. In 1248, he launched what would be called the Seventh Crusade. His ships sailed for Egypt, where he believed a strong blow could open the road to Jerusalem. But Egypt was not the same place it had been. The Mamluks, trained in battle and hardened by discipline, met the French army with precision. Louis was captured, ransomed, His men scattered. He returned home, not in defeat, but in reflection. Still, he did not abandon the dream. Years later, he tried again, this time to Tunis, but the heat and disease were cruel. Louis died there, not with a sword in hand, but with fever in his blood. His death marked more than the end of a crusade. It marked the quiet closing of an age. After him, no king would lead such a campaign again. There were smaller efforts, naval raids, alliances with distant Mongol armies, secret envoys, but nothing lasting, nothing with roots. The Holy Land remained lost, not just in geography, but in the imagination of Europe. The Church continued to speak of it. Pilgrimage remained. Songs still told of the old victories, though more with longing than pride. But power had moved elsewhere. The focus of Christian kings turned inward, toward their borders, their economies, their rivalries. England and France were soon at war again, not for the cross, but for crowns. Italy fractured. Germany drifted. The papacy, once the loudest voice for the crusade, now found itself embroiled in its own crises. There were disputes between popes and emperors, battles for influence, and slowly, the authority of the church began to erode. Not gone, but no longer unquestioned. New ideas stirred, new fears, and in the quiet corners of monasteries and universities, a different kind of war was being prepared, not for Jerusalem, but for the soul of Europe itself. Reformation, though still far away, cast a long shadow. The crusade, once so central, now felt like another chapter. Still sacred, but distant. And in the east, the land slowly closed over the wounds. The Mamluks, firm in their control, erased the last remnants of crusader walls. Churches were turned into stables or markets. Castles were taken stone by stone. Local Christians, long caught between sides, continued to live quietly. They prayed in smaller rooms now. They sang their hymns low. Muslims, once divided by rival dynasties, now ruled with a kind of tired confidence. The Crusaders were gone, but the memory of them remained. In stories, in ruins, in the names carved into stones along the sea. The Eastern Mediterranean no longer expected ships from Europe. It watched the horizon with a new calm, not trusting, but no longer afraid. The Holy Land, so often fought for, now belonged again to those who lived on it. Its hills remembered blood. Its rivers remembered tears. But its soil, always patient, had begun to heal. Back in Europe, the memory of the Crusades began to change. Once preached from every cathedral, now they were folded into history. Chroniclers wrote long accounts, full of dates and names and saints, but the people who read them were not preparing for battle. They were learning, reflecting. By the end of the 13th century, the Crusades had become less a movement than a memory. Their symbols were still powerful. The Red Cross still appeared on shields and banners, but it no longer summoned armies. The world was entering a colder age, one of plague, of famine, of schism. There would be new wars, many, but none would carry the old promise. The idea that war could be holy, that blood could cleanse, that faith could ride on horseback across deserts. That time had passed. And yet, something lingered. In the ruins along the coasts, in the narrow streets of Acre, now quiet, in the olive groves outside Jerusalem. The Crusades had failed, but they had not disappeared. Their echo lived on in the way East and West saw one another, in the language of sermons, in the fears passed down through generations. The Holy Land had been both a battlefield and a mirror. It showed what men were willing to do in God's name, what they believed, what they destroyed. The final offensives of the Crusades were not marked by grand endings. There were no last stands sung in glory, only walls abandoned, cities surrendered, ships that left and never returned. The crusade had been a dream carried too far, held too long, and like all long dreams, it ended in waking, not suddenly, but slowly. With each unclaimed letter, each unopened gate, each prayer whispered without answer. So the world turned, the sea quieted, the hills of Palestine grew wild again, and the swords once lifted high in devotion began to rust in silence. The summer of 1291 arrived like a slow shadow creeping over the coast. Acre, the last stronghold of the Crusader states, had stood for decades as a fragile island amid a sea of change. Its walls bore the scars of countless sieges. Its streets were narrow, crowded, and lined with the echoes of prayers spoken in many tongues. For those who lived there, the city was more than stone and mortar. It was hope, memory, a last tether to a dream now fading into dusk. The Mamluks, patient and relentless, had long watched from the deserts and hills beyond. Their armies grew stronger, their strategies sharper. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, heir to a line of fierce rulers, understood the cost of waiting. The fall of Acre would mean more than the loss of a city. It would mean the end of an era. For months, his forces gathered, horsemen, archers, engineers. The siege began in late spring, under a sky heavy with heat and dust. The Crusaders inside prepared as best they could. They repaired walls, stocked supplies, and prayed. But their numbers were few, their spirits frayed. The knights who had once charged across open fields now paced narrow alleys, eyes searching the horizon for ships that would not come. The city's defenders fought with desperation, their faith a shield as much as their swords. But the Mamluks were patient. They built siege engines, they tunneled beneath walls, they cut off supplies. Each day wore the city thinner. The air inside grew heavy with smoke and fear. The bells rang constantly, calling the faithful to prayers that felt like farewells. Outside, the attackers advanced steadily, their banners dark against the bright sky. The battle was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling. Walls crumbled, gates fell, streets flooded with soldiers and dust. The city's soul cracked. Families fled toward the harbour, desperate for passage. Monks clutched relics to their chests, knowing they could not save what mattered most. And when the gates finally opened, the fighting was brutal but brief. The defenders, weary and broken, surrendered. The Mamluks poured in, not with mercy, but with certainty. The last Crusader fortress in the Holy Land had fallen. The fall of Acre marked the end of centuries of war fought under the banner of the cross in that distant land. It was a collapse not just of a city, but of an idea. The Crusades, once vibrant with hope and zeal, had faded into memory. Europe watched with disbelief and sorrow. Letters from survivors told tales of loss and exile. The orders of knights scattered, some finding refuge in Cyprus, others dissolving into legend. The church mourned, but also faced new questions. What now remained of the dream? What had been gained? What had been lost? The answers were complex. The Crusades had shaped the medieval world in ways both visible and invisible. They had forged connections, trade, knowledge, culture, even as they sowed division. They had tested faith and power alike. The cost was counted not only in lives, but in broken trust and shifting alliances. In the years following Acre's fall, Europe turned inward. New conflicts arose, dynastic wars, political struggles, religious debates, each shaped by the shadows of the Crusades. The memory of the wars shaped identities, fears, and hopes for generations. The Holy Land itself changed. Under Mamluk rule, the cities healed slowly. Churches and mosques stood side by side, markets thrived again, and people from many backgrounds lived their daily lives. The land held its scars, but it breathed anew. The Crusader castles, once symbols of foreign power, crumbled into ruins, claimed by time and nature. The sea carried stories back west, of distant lands lost and battles won and lost, not by swords alone, but by the slow passage of history. The consequences of the Crusades reached far beyond the Mediterranean shores. Europe's political landscape had shifted. Monarchs grew stronger, centralizing power. Feudal lords found their influence waning. The papacy, once the voice that called knights to arms, struggled with internal divisions and challenges to its authority. The wars had drained coffers and emptied fields, leading to social changes that rippled through towns and kingdoms. Trade expanded in new directions. Ideas and goods from east to west flowed in a new current, weaving a complex tapestry of cultures and beliefs. Yet the Crusades also left wounds that would not heal easily. The relations between Christians and Muslims, Jews and others, were marked by suspicion and memory of violence that lasted for centuries. Myths grew around the wars of heroism and villainy, faith and betrayal, shaping narratives that sometimes blurred truth and legend. These stories influenced not just the medieval world, but the centuries to come. In the quiet aftermath, those who had lived through the Crusades carried their stories into old age. Some were knights who had ridden under banners now forgotten. Others were pilgrims who had walked dusty roads to sacred sites. Some were local people caught between worlds, whose lives were forever changed by the tides of war. Their memories were not of grand victories alone, but of loss and silence, of families torn apart, of promises made and broken. These personal histories became the threads that wove the larger tapestry of a time both brutal and sacred. And as the medieval world moved toward new horizons, the legacy of the Crusades remained, a reminder of what happens when faith, power, and ambition collide, when ideals meet reality, when the cost is counted not just in gold or land, but in the quiet suffering of those caught in the middle. The land itself, ancient and enduring, outlasted empires and kingdoms. The hills and valleys of Palestine held their secrets beneath olive trees and stones. The sea washed away footprints but kept the stories alive in its waves. The ruins of castles and churches whispered in the wind. Time turned the pages of history slowly, but it did not forget. And so the Crusades ended, not with a blaze, but with a long, slow fading, like a story told in a quiet voice as night falls. A story of hope and heartbreak, of faith and failure, of human dreams carried across deserts and seas, only to find that even the strongest sword can break, and the most fervent prayer can go unanswered. Memory is a fragile thing. It slips through fingers like sand, yet it builds mountains in the mind. The Crusades, long after the last sword was sheathed and the last city lost, lived on in the stories told beside fires and in the quiet halls of monasteries. These were tales of glory and sacrifice, of betrayal and loss. Yet they were also stories shaped by longing, by fear, by the need to find meaning in chaos. For those who lived through the wars, memory was heavy. It carried the weight of the dead, the missing, the promises unkept. It was not just about battles fought, but about what was left behind. Empty homes, broken families, faded faith. The price of memory was often silence, the unspeakable grief that cannot be sung. Across Europe, chroniclers wrote of kings and knights, of battles and sieges. But between the lines, there were gaps. The voices of women, of peasants, of those caught in the crossfire. Their stories faded into shadows, yet their lives were no less real. The wars reshaped not just borders, but societies. The Crusades introduced new goods and ideas, but also new suspicions. The fear of the other grew sharper. Christians, Muslims, Jews, each community carried wounds that time could not fully heal. The echoes of conflict shaped relations for generations, coloring how people saw one another. In the East, the memory of the Crusades was complex. Some saw the invaders as villains, others as part of a shared history that could not be undone. The landscape still bore the marks. Ruined castles, ancient churches, repurposed or abandoned. The land itself remembered the turmoil, as stones held stories not written in books. Yet memory was also a source of resilience. Communities rebuilt, adapted, and continued their lives in the shadow of the past. Pilgrimages still brought the faithful, now tempered by caution and respect. Religious practices evolved, influenced by centuries of contact and conflict. The legacy of the Crusades was not only destruction, but also connection. In Europe, the Crusades entered the realm of myth. Songs and poems celebrated heroes, while sermons warned of sin and redemption. The image of the knight, the holy warrior, took shape in ways that blended fact and fiction. These stories inspired art, literature, and even politics long after the last cross had fallen. Yet with myth came distortion. The complexity of the wars was lost in black and white tales of good and evil. The true cost, the human lives, the cultural exchanges, the unintended consequences, became harder to see. Over time, the Crusades influenced how people understood themselves and others. In the West, they fueled a sense of identity tied to faith and conquest. In the East, they became part of narratives of resistance and survival. These memories shaped conflicts far beyond the medieval world, echoing into modern times. The price of memory was not only in what was remembered, but also in what was forgotten. The voices lost, the nuances erased, the lessons unlearned. Yet memory also held the power to heal, to teach, to remind. Museums, texts, and traditions preserved fragments of the past. Scholars sought to uncover truths buried beneath layers of legend and bias. The Crusades became a subject not only of history, but of reflection, on the dangers of zealotry, on the cost of war, on the fragile nature of coexistence. In this, the price of memory was a call to listen beyond the battles, to hear the quiet stories of those who lived between the lines, to understand that history is not just the story of kings and armies, but of people, each carrying hope, fear, and the desire for peace. And so the Crusades remain with us, not just as events long past, but as reminders. Reminders of what happens when faith is turned to force, when power is sought in the name of God, when the human cost is counted in silence and sorrow. The price of memory is heavy, but it is also necessary. For in remembering, there is the chance to change, to find new ways to meet, to speak, to build, to move beyond the shadows of the past toward a future shaped by understanding and respect. The fire of the Crusades burned long, but it did not consume everything. What remains after the smoke clears is neither simple nor certain. It is a landscape shaped by the layers of history. Stones piled by hands both gentle and harsh, cities rebuilt upon ruins, faiths entwined in ways unexpected. The Holy Land, once the stage for war and prayer, holds traces of those who came seeking salvation, and those who defended their homes. Its hills carry footprints of pilgrims and soldiers alike. The seas that lap its shores still whisper of ships that sailed with hope and despair. The castles, now crumbled or reclaimed by earth, remind us that power is fleeting. The churches and mosques that stand together tell stories of coexistence born from conflict. The human heart, perhaps, is the most complex landscape of all. It holds memories of hate and forgiveness, of fear and courage, of division and unity. The Crusades left scars, yes, but they also left connections, threads woven through time and space. These threads bind East and West, past and present, in ways that shape how we see each other today. History does not end. It folds and unfolds like waves on the shore. The stories of the Crusades are part of that endless movement. They remind us that even the strongest flames fade, that walls built with stones can be broken, that wars meant to last forever are carried into the silence of memory. Yet in that silence, there is space for something new, for reflection, for learning, for hope. The world after the Crusades was changed, but it was not defeated. New ideas arose, trade grew between distant lands, cultures mingled in markets and courts, people found ways to live with the legacies of pain and triumph. The echoes of the Crusades can still be heard in language, in art, in faith. They are reminders of human longing for meaning, for justice, for belonging. And they are warnings, warnings about the cost of turning belief into battle, about the danger of seeing the world in simple lines of us and them, about the quiet suffering that follows the noise of war. As night falls on this story, we hold close the faces of those who lived it. Not just kings and knights, but the families torn apart, the children who never saw home again, the souls who carried hope beneath armor and prayer. Their stories are woven into the fabric of time. They call us to remember with kindness, to hold history gently, to seek peace not just in words, but in action. The Crusades are part of our shared human journey, a chapter marked by fire and shadow, but also by the enduring light of memory and understanding. And so, as we close this tale, we carry forward the lessons hidden in the ashes. That the past is never far from us. That peace must be built carefully, with patience and care. That what remains after the fire is a chance to choose differently, to build bridges where walls once stood, to listen, to heal, to dream anew.